All right, I think it's time to get started. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good day, wherever you are in the world, welcome. My name is Catherine Atmansky. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm of mixed European ancestry. I also serve as a professor in the School of Leadership Studies at Royal Roads University, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you today to this webinar with Harley and Sue Eagle on Indigenous cultural safety and humility. Harley and Sue will be addressing some very exciting emergent understandings in this field. And so welcome one and all. I invite you now to, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat room by acknowledging the ancestral lands from which you're joining. And at the same time, I will acknowledge that Royal Roads University, the campus itself, is located on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, now known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. And it is with so much gratitude that I and we live, work, and learn here, where the past, present, and future of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, staff, and community members come together. And so we are delighted to be here with you today with Harley and Sue as we engage in this important learning. And I would like to also thank and acknowledge the School of Leadership Studies, particularly the Masters of Arts in Leadership, for sponsoring this webinar, and also to the Royal Roads University Office of Research for granting the funds through a research and professional development grant to enable this webinar to be open so widely to the public and to members of the Royal Roads University community. So welcome one and all. I will just briefly mention that in addition to the Masters of Arts in Leadership, which on the registration sheet, I did notice that a number of you are interested in that program. And so we do have a Masters of Arts in Leadership. We have a fully online version, and we also have a blended version with a campus residency 2 weeks in the summer months. We also have a specialization in health, and a number of graduate certificates and diplomas as well. So we have a graduate certificate in leadership, a graduate certificate in values-based leadership, which ladders directly into a Master's of Arts in Leadership with an executive specialization, an executive leadership specialization, which I noticed on the registration sheet, a number of you are interested in that as well. We also have a number of global leadership programs, both an on-campus delivery option and a blended. By blended, I mean there are some elements that are online and some elements that are in person. So we have an accelerated 13-month intensive, or we have the regular 2-year programming for global leadership as well. And of course, there are graduate certificates and graduate diplomas that ladder into the global leadership programming. So if you are interested in any of these programs, please do reach out with the contact information provided to you by Ariana, who's on the line here. You probably saw a lovely reminder message in your inbox this morning from Ariana, and we'd be very happy to share any further information. And without much further ado, sorry, I've got one more slide here. I'll just let you know how to get in touch with us. If you don't reply to Ariana, you can get in touch with learn.more@royalroads.ca, and we'd be happy to offer further information about those programs. And now I would like to pass it over to the Acting Director of the School of Leadership Studies, Dr. Niels Agargupta, to introduce our special guests and hosts of the series, Sue and Harley Eagle. Over to you, Niels.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, Niels Agargupta. I am a white immigrant settler on the lands of the Lekwungen-speaking First Nations of the Esquimalt and Songhees. In my role as the acting school director, I've been really very fortunate to work with a group of people, including Catherine, who have been really excited by the idea of decolonization and looking at how we can help students and faculty and the whole community move from a more of a transformative view of what decolonization might look like, rather than where things typically start at the performative level. This session today is one example of where we at the school and at Royal Roads really are working to make decolonization transformative. I'm really excited to be with Harley and Sue this morning, and I'm excited by the call to action they have for us to engage in creating a decolonized, anti-racist learning set of relationships. Um, this really is a tribute to Harley and Sue's outstanding work that this session has received so much interest. Let me quickly introduce our speakers. So Harley Eagle is Indigenous of Dakota and Ojibwe ancestry, originally from Saskatchewan. He's lived over 25 years on Vancouver Island and is currently residing in the traditional territory of the Comox peoples. He's an Indigenous cultural safety and humility consultant who facilitates workshops and sessions that explore and build a foundation of understanding of an Indigenous perspective on colonization, addressing systemic racism and trauma-informed practice. He also consults with many organizations across several societal sectors to strengthen their Indigenous cultural safety and humility capacity. Harley's worked previously with our faculty in the School of Leadership Studies, and he has helped us with our MA in Leadership Health specialization as the Indigenous Scholar in Residence for several years. It's absolutely wonderful to see you, Harley, again. Sue Eagle is a white settler of Flemish Mennonite descent who strives to remain a respectful, accountable, though uninvited guest of the land and the people who are the original caretakers wherever she lives and visits. Sue's a registered social worker with 30 years of experience. She says that her work and life have created opportunities for her to learn about, develop, and delve into tools for dismantling racist oppression and unpacking white privilege. Most of Sue's career has focused on Indigenous social justice advocacy, education, and working towards systemic change. Welcome, Sue. So I'd now like to invite Harley and Sue to take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Niels, and thank you, Catherine, and Royal Roads, and thank you all for being here. It was so wonderful to watch the chat and see where everybody's from and everybody's background and everybody's land acknowledgements and territory acknowledgements. It just, yeah, I think in a few moments when we get rolling here, Sue and I are going to do a bit more of introduction. So I'll say a few words too about the wonderful places that I'm seeing many people are from. But let me share my slides with you. Otherwise, I can ramble on. So the slides really help me to stay focused. And yeah, you'll be hearing from both myself and Sue. So if I could get a thumbs up that you can see the slides there, Sue, if they're showing. Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, we're here to talk about something that we find quite exciting for the work that we're doing. And when I say exciting, I don't mean easy. The work is, decolonizing and addressing systemic racism is not easy work by any means, but it also is life-giving, especially when Sue starts to talk about somatics, it really can change the way that you walk in this world, and you can start to change the influences of colonization on our bodies. And then that affects our relationships, not only with people and people around us, but also the land and those elements that we can't see as well. So it's a good journey. And I also, just in listening to Neil's introduction, that it's interesting to think that English and the way that we often talk about ourselves and talk about things kind of sets them in stone almost, but there's movement to everything. Everything's always changing, right? And so it's kind of like the introductions that we provide yesterday are out of date now. Because wonderful things continue to happen and emerge in our own lives. So, but we'll talk about that as we go further along here. So Sue and I would like to also offer our land acknowledgement to the Comox territory and peoples where we live, which include the Ayexan, Pantlach, and Satlut people as well. And if you heard in Sue's introduction there that Niels provided, we consider ourselves uninvited guests in these communities. because for myself, even though I'm Indigenous, I'm not from these territories. And really, because of the influence of colonization on my life and the lives of my family, we haven't followed the protocols that we would have, say, 300 years ago. We would have entered into this territory in a certain way, and we would have introduced ourselves and asked permission. We would have let people know our intentions, and then we would have waited for the protocol of invitation to be on the land. We haven't done that. We've fallen into colonial patterns ourselves. So that's why, one of the reasons why we consider ourselves uninvited guests. However, we are in relationship with Comox people. I'm just so overwhelmed at the hospitality that we feel from the Comox people. And I have an office in their territory, and so we continue to build relationship. And they know that one day we would like to take care of those protocols so that we can be considered invited guests into these territories. But until that happens, we definitely consider ourselves uninvited guests into these territories. So just a couple more words about myself. It's a wonderful introduction. I guess some of the things that I wanted to add was that, as I was reading through your land acknowledgements, it reminded me that I wanted to say that we've lived in other places as well throughout Turtle Island. We lived in South Dakota on Pine Ridge Reservation for about 7 years, and then also we lived in Winnipeg for about 10 years. And then Sue is from Leamington, Ontario. And so, I grew up in Treaty 6 territory in a place called Wapahaska Dakota First Nation, just south of Saskatoon, and lived in several communities in that area. But I just wanted to mention from me that I'm Dakota and Anishinaabe, which is an Ojibwe speaking part of the Anishinaabe Nation. My mother would call herself Soto. But we're also connected to the Métis Nation as well. Back when our original leader, Whitecap, Wapahaska, was put on a reserve in southern Saskatchewan, he actually refused to be in that area because he wanted to be close to the Métis people who he was very close to in Round Plain, just south of Saskatoon. So he actually requested and said he's not going to take that land. He wants to be up by the Métis people. So we were closely allied with the Métis Nation, and in particular during the Battle of the Kosh, just north of Saskatoon, many of our people went and fought alongside Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont and the Métis people, and several of my relatives lost their lives during that time as well. So I really feel strongly about being allied with Métis people because of that historical connection that we have. And then also on my mother's side, we have a Métis relative that we didn't know about for many years. It's only been in the last few years that we realized, when I started to dig a little bit, when I saw a picture of my grandmother and remembered her from my youth, but I knew that she was considered to be from somewhere else. But then I looked at her and I said, she's Indigenous. And my mother said, yes, she's Métis. And so we have Métis heritage on my mother's side as well that we continue to explore. And then the last thing I wanted to say, and just noticing again some of the land acknowledgements, much of the work that I do and I've been doing for the last 5 years involves working with an organization that is fairly predominantly, it does its work in the Arctic of North America and Canada and Alaska. And so bringing in that perspective of people from the far north is so important to my work. And I learned so much because for the most part, many of us in the South have no idea of what life is like in the Arctic. And so I get the opportunity to hear those stories, hear those experiences, and then connect them into the work that I do. So I'm very influenced by the people of the far north as well. I just wanted to say those few things. Sue, is there anything that you wanted to add?
I think a lot of my introduction has already been said. I'm looking forward to this time together with all of you. Yeah, I continue to learn, and anything I say here today is probably going to change tomorrow. But it's exciting work that's emerging, and yeah, just so glad that there's so many of you interested in this, and looking forward to our time together. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Sue. Oh, and one last thing too. There was a few notes saying people saying hello to me that I know in chat. So hello to those people that said a direct hello to me. Wonderful that you're here. So a couple other acknowledgements that we wanted to talk about was it can be it's linked to the word protocol. It's a word that we often use, and for those of you that work with Indigenous people, we often use this word quite a bit, especially for how we start our meetings and our gatherings. Like, for instance, if we were at a big gathering right now, public gathering in some big conference center somewhere, not only would we be providing acknowledgements, we also would have had a welcome from the local First Nation. And that probably would have included words of wisdom from elders and knowledge keepers, reminders of those things that we should be holding ourselves, how we should hold ourselves when we come together in a public setting. So probably talking about some values and things like that. We probably would have had some singing and maybe some drumming and maybe some dancing and even ceremony as well would have taken place. We probably would have shared some food together, and we probably would have shared a few laughs, a few jokes probably would have been told, and we would have done a formal introduction where we would have turned to one another and greeted each other. So all of those things we call customs or protocols. So that got me interested a few years ago in trying to understand, where does this word come from, protocol? And it's actually referencing an important document and how you start that important document with introductions and glossaries and table of contents and that sort of thing. But it can also reference the mechanics of putting a book together, of making a book with the pages and the covers and the binding and that sort of thing. And protocol literally translates from Latin as first glue, first glue. So when I heard that and I read that, I thought, well, that's perfect for how Indigenous people often think about the protocols and customs that we're doing at the beginning of our gatherings. We're trying to activate the glue that holds us together as an individual, the reminder of those values and how to show up when we're meeting in a public place like that, and for a community. How do we come together, especially if we have some difficult work to do? We have to have those things, those reminders and the activation of those important elements that help us to be our best self with one another. And so we often talk about that as the glue that holds us together, but we can also think about it in another way. There's also glue that holds colonialism together. And really, for me, that's what decolonizing is. It's about exposing those elements that hold colonialism together and working at them. And if you know the nature of glue, the first time you pull it apart, it's hard to pull it apart and it springs back. And so that's what happens too when we work on decolonizing. We can expose it a little bit, but it's going to spring back. But the more we look at, the more we work at it, it lessens its power. And eventually, hopefully, that colonial glue snaps. And the way that we do that is by activating the glue that holds us together. So to me, that's what decolonizing is. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And we need that glue that holds us together because of the challenges that so many of us are carrying in this moment, whether it's just the pressures of our job and our family life, whether it's what's occurring in the world that's impacting us, all of the terrible things that are happening in many places throughout the world, or maybe the climate has us quite worried and anxious, or maybe it's the increase in violence that we seem to be noticing, not only in other parts of the world, but also in our own backyards. So we know that we carry a lot of challenges in this moment. So activating that glue that holds us together is important. So in this moment, for this time that we have together, by way of self-care, I just want to encourage you to, take some deep breaths in this moment. Maybe you've already done some centering this morning, but I encourage you to do that as well. Even in this moment, just a few nice deep breaths. Have some things around you as well, like maybe some art material, if you're a knitter, a crocheter, or if you bead. Those kinds of things that we can do that are tactile and creative and help us to stay centered. And really, this notion comes from elders and knowledge keepers that we've worked with over the years, And when we've come to gatherings, they've reminded us to make sure that you always have snacks, beverages, something that people can consume. And they say the thinking behind that is that as they're consuming those items, they're also consuming your words, your energy, and so it's taking it in a deep way. Western science has caught up with that, and what they realize is happening in those moments is that we're bringing ourselves into our back into our bodies. Because what happens when we talk about things like colonialism from Indigenous perspectives, and we start to expose some of those secrets that we don't know about here really throughout the world in terms of colonization, it can unsettle us. We can be activated, and sometimes our minds start to race. So anything that we can do that stimulates our primary senses helps to bring us back into our bodies. So it's something that we do in our workshops as best we can to bring items for people, or to recommend people bring knitting, crocheting, beading, anything like that. We often have coloring material and other art material, fidget toys. For myself, I often have stones around my desk, right? I have stones around my desk, and I'm often holding a stone because that helps me to stay present and in my body as well. And then we can also take some encouragement, because there's such a need for decolonizing in our world right now. Even if you're just watching the terrible things that are happening, it can stimulate us into realizing we have to do something about this. And then there's also official calls to action throughout our society as well. Certainly here in Canada, we have the TRC calls, Truth and Reconciliation Commission on residential schools, calls to action. We have some other items, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That's a global call to action as well. So in this moment, we're doing what we're being called to do by taking action, by building our awareness. So this is what we're hoping to do today, I'm going to provide a few foundations of the concept of Indigenous cultural safety and humility. And then we want to talk about those emerging things, those things that are exciting us in this moment, and others as well, as we journey on this road of decolonizing and healing. And then Sue is going to provide a focus on somatics and how it's being utilized to address colonialism and systemic racism within organizations. And we can also add there within ourselves as well, because really that's where all of this starts, is by looking within ourselves to start to undo those patterns so that we can be fully present, or is more fully present on this journey as well. So the way that we do this work is we think about, and this will be very familiar to those of you who are connected with Royal Roads. We take a systems thinking approach. Some people call it the 1,000-foot view or the balcony view. It's that idea of coming up above the situation and looking at it, understanding the big picture as best we can, so that we know what we're up against and we can figure out where we want to go from this perspective. It's also a bit of a safer place to look at things like colonialism from this vantage point. And then eventually you can also locate yourself in this big picture and see from this safer place up above to notice where you are in this picture. And then you can identify things around you. So it's a helpful way of thinking about this work. It's a very helpful approach to start building our awareness and understanding our journey in front of us. For the work that we do, we are certainly influenced by Indigenous culture. I bring the culture that I carry, is Lakota and Anishinaabe. And this is a symbol that's familiar to both my heritage on both sides of my family. We often call it the medicine wheel. And so we put this here because we want people to know that we are certainly influenced by, and we take the guidance of Indigenous culture and teachings and language to help guide the work that we're doing. But if you notice, the medicine wheel in this picture is translucent. And the reason why it is because, for Sue and I, we live in somebody else's territory. So even though I'm guided by my culture, it's very important for me to point out the genius and brilliance of the people of this part of the world. So that's why it's translucent, because that's something that you folks can do as well, is to look to your own cultures, to wherever you're from, if you're Indigenous, or for those of you that are allies in other people's territories, look for their genius and brilliance and their ways of expressing life through symbols and teachings and language and understandings of land and all of those sorts of things. And this picture is really highlights what Indigenous cultural safety is, because sometimes we think that cultural safety is about teaching Indigenous culture, even though, as I said, we're influenced by it and it shapes the way we do our work. That's not our role to teach Indigenous culture. In fact, our role is to look at colonial structures. So in this picture, it's the same vantage point, the side of the hill, but now instead of the river, we have a road. And that road is a metaphor for colonial structures. And so that's what we try to do, is we look at those structures, we understand their power dynamics, we try to understand their history, and a lot of times it's a history of violence and harm. We want to understand those kinds of dynamics, but we also want to identify, if this is our reality, how can we use this in a helpful way? And then how can we change those elements that still continue to cause harm as well? And so I'm just going to share with you very quickly an origin story of Indigenous cultural safety. And this is important for me, especially as an Indigenous man. I want to make sure that I acknowledge the Maori people of New Zealand, of Aotearoa, and particularly the Maori women who were nurses. And they're over 30 years ago now, that's where this concept came out of, Indigenous Maori nurses. When they were struggling with the healthcare system that didn't understand their dynamics as Indigenous people, they brought forward this concept that helped the healthcare system understand the dynamics. And so they put together this really powerful concept, and the healthcare system started to utilize it, and it grew. And so New Zealand has been working with this concept for many years. It went over to Australia. And now it's come to other parts of the world as well. And now cultural humility is used in many different sectors, not just healthcare. It's a good framework for looking at colonization and then decolonizing as well. So I'm going to share with you one definition of cultural safety. There's many out there if you look at the literature, but we really like this one because and most of the definitions have a very similar feel to this. But if you think of that picture that I just showed you of the side of the hill and the road, this is what cultural safety is expressing. It's an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances inherent in the healthcare or any system. So just think of that side of the hill. So we look at the structures and we try to change those power imbalances, and hopefully it results in what you see at the bottom part of the definition. But this is an aspirational place. It's where we want to get to. And it's going to take, in my opinion, generations to get to this place. So then that begs the question, how do we get there? And so First Nations Health Authority, whose definition this is, First Nations Health Authority is from BC here, and they've been working for the last 10 years to really bring this concept forward in the healthcare world. So they also introduced us to the concept of cultural humility. And so this is how we can attain or get to or be on the journey of cultural safety, because cultural humility is the process of self-reflection, first looking inward to understand our personal biases and patterns that have been created by colonialism within ourselves. And really that's what Sue is going to be talking about today, is understanding the impact of colonization on our bodies. And then to see how they show up and how the systems condition us to be colonized. So then that gives us an idea of what we need to change. And we use respectful processes built on Indigenous ways of engaging with one another and understanding relationship based on mutual trust. And then cultural humility also acknowledges that we are learners, especially when we're understanding another person's experience, and in a lot of cases, our own experiences as well. Sometimes we don't understand. It's been kind of kept secret from us of our experiences. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a few moments. One way that we talk about the differences between Indigenous and Western worldview that we find is helpful in doing this work is I'm gonna bring back the medicine wheel just for a moment, but I'm not gonna bring it to teach you about it. I'm gonna use it to illustrate the difference between Indigenous and Western worldview. So I'm gonna show it to you, but again, not to teach you about it, but just to illustrate the difference. So the medicine wheel can teach us so many different things. And they say you can go your whole life and continue to learn from this symbol. But in one way that we can talk about it is how we are constructed as a human being. So in our teachings, we say that we're made up of 4 elements in our bodies: our spiritual element, or our spirit in the top quadrant. We also are emotional creatures, so it's important to nurture and to respond to emotion. And then the bottom part is our physicality, or our relationships as well. Just as our bodies are a bunch of microcosms all working together to create our body, that's that understanding in this quadrant as well. It's like a relational quadrant. And then the last quadrant is considered the intellect. So making sure that we continue to stimulate our minds, that we think about our brains and even our nervous systems, and to nurture those as well. And if we can nurture all of those quadrants, then it helps us to walk in balance. This can also speak to a process. And this is where it becomes really important to think about this as a process. So in the spiritual realm, the first quadrant, that's where we set the tone. That's why we do protocols and customs. That's what we're doing. We're acknowledging that part of us in coming together. So we set the tone and do our protocols in that part of the process. Then we go to the next quadrant, the emotional quadrant, and that's where we can tell our stories. We can connect with each other and speak about what's going on in our lives in the moment. And that helps to build trust and understanding as we share about ourselves in that moment. And then the next quadrant over is like, let's say we were working on a conflict, that we had gathered to work on a conflict. In the physical realm, this is where you would start to peel back the layers to understand, why did this conflict happen? You would ask questions and be curious and peel back layers and engage with one another to get to the root of the problem. And then once you've done those steps, then you're ready to make a decision. What are we going to do about this conflict? How are we going to deal with it? You do that in the intellectual realm. So this is a really helpful process, and we use it in so many different ways. It shows up in Indigenous cultural safety work. It shows up in conflict resolution work. It's a good community way of being together. However, we live in a society, in a Western society, where there's another symbol that guides the way that we live our lives. It constructs, how we gather and what that looks like. In fact, it's guiding the way that we're gathering here today as well. It's such a powerful symbol that we've normalized it. We don't even see it as a symbol anymore, but it's everywhere within our society. In fact, probably most of us on this call are wearing the symbol in this moment, or we can look around our spaces and often see the symbol. It's usually on the walls in our homes. It's definitely in our places of business. You'll see this symbol up almost in every room. Sometimes you'll see it in city squares, up on towers. It's such a profound symbol, but so normalized that we don't even see it as a symbol anymore, yet it guides our life just about in every aspect. So I'm going to share that symbol with you now. This is the symbol that I'm talking about, the clock. And our Western understanding of time, that's really not that old. The universal or global understanding of time is not that old. It's developed in the 17th century because folks needed some congruency with time, because before that there wasn't. So in order to enact capitalism and commerce, it needed a global understanding of time to confine that and guide that work. But yet it's come to direct everything that we do in our lives. And oftentimes we don't have the space or time to pay attention to the medicine wheel and that community way of being if we've only allotted 10 minutes for our time together. Or if we're working with physicians, they've only allotted 8 minutes to work with us, things like that. It's constructed our way of being with one another. It guides the way that we come together, and it's guiding the way that we've come together today as well. So then that leads us to the question, so what do we do about this? And I used to tell people I don't know what the way forward is, but I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and at this point. And so that's one of the things that's been emerging in this work, is trying to think about that. So how does that look? How does the both and look? So an Indigenous gentleman by the name of Willie Ermine talks about it this way. He says that we have to develop a decolonized ethical space that's both and. It's recognizing that we live in a world that's constructed by the clock and it guides us in our way of interacting, but how do we start bringing forward those other ways of living, those indigenous and ancient ways of being with one another? How do we start to bring those forward? So he calls that decolonized ethical space. It's an aware both and zone, is to understand those dynamics of what we're up against and what we want to be, perhaps, and trying to figure out how do we combine that. So it shifts our perspectives to understand that there's more than one way of doing our work. And then also it requires intentionally creating space for respect and mindfulness for both worlds. And I hope you saw that in the definition of cultural safety and cultural humility, where it talks about that, creating spaces built on mutual trust so that we can do this work. And so that's what it's referencing, is this both and space. And then it also can be a space where we can address big issues like systemic racism and colonialism. That's what we've been doing in this work of Indigenous cultural safety, is striving to address those big issues like the legacy and the current reality of colonization, as well as that big issue that we all talk about, systemic racism, but oftentimes we don't fully understand it. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes we see racism in this world as kind of something common. We all have kind of a common understanding, and usually it's about those ugly interactions between individuals. But if we use the iceberg as a metaphor, that's a part of racism, but there's much more to it as well. So if we can create spaces where we can understand those dynamics and start to address them, I think we'll start to undo the patterns of systemic racism in our societies. So I'm just going to fit a definition of cultural safety into this metaphor of the iceberg. So the tip of the iceberg, that which we commonly see, are those ugly interactions between individuals, usually based on hate and that sort of thing. So that's a part of it, but there's much more to it. Racism also includes a system of complex social and political mechanisms that give shape and purpose to laws and bureaucracies that have been in place for hundreds of years across many generations. Because we work on Indigenous cultural safety, the examples that I'm providing here are based on our experiences as Indigenous people. So it's things like the Indian Act for First Nations people. It's the reserve system. It's the Hamlet system. It's the Métis community settlements and all of those legislations that were put in place to suppress and oppress Métis people and Inuit people and First Nations people. It's things like the doctrine of discovery, those big structures, oftentimes hidden. We don't even know that they're there, but yet they are very oppressive in their nature, and they're backed up by government decisions and government policies, legislations, enforced as well on the lives of Indigenous people. So that's a part of systemic racism. And I want to be clear here, the work that we do is based on Indigenous cultural safety, so Indigenous experiences, but there's other people that have been oppressed and have legislations enacted on their lives as well. So in fact, Indigenous cultural safety is a helpful entry point into understanding the patterns of colonization that harm so many people, not only Indigenous people, but other groups as well. So you start to see that bigger picture even when you use these kinds of strategies around Indigenous cultural safety. And then the problem is when we're brought up in such a system, we're raised in a system like that, it conditions us, including our bodies, including somatically, to see and to treat others and to treat ourselves and the environment around us as if they are lesser or more valued than others. So that's kind of the analysis that we work from, if you will, of what we're up against in terms of systemic racism and colonialism. So how do we start to address these things? We bring in processes that are built on different ways of being, looking to those ancient ways that have been tried and true for thousands of years. And for myself as an Indigenous person, I look to those practices and teachings from my culture, but you'll find them in other cultures as well. So the circle process, which is familiar to many cultures throughout the world, but it's become such an important part of our work. In fact, elders have told us over the years, never lose the circle process. That has to be a part of Indigenous cultural safety work. So it helps to build trust and it also encourages authentic relationship. And remember when I talked about the glue that holds us together? When elders and knowledge keepers have those reminders during those protocols, they often speak to things like humility, that remembering that we're all connected, that we need each other, and no one is greater or less than the other. All of our voices are important. So we come together in the circle and we hear what everybody has to say, and they get to share their experiences, wisdom, and knowledge with everyone. And that includes respect, because we take the time to listen to everybody's thoughts and feelings and experiences and wisdom. So everybody's voice is so important. Integrity is about walking with honor, with ethics and principles that come from many different sources. And we all strive to walk with values, and we've been taught from so many different ways, but we encourage that in the circle process, to walk with integrity, to hold yourself with integrity, to treat others with integrity. We always like to say in the circle process as well, to hold each other's stories with integrity. Because sometimes we share deep things in the circle, very personal things, and we want people to know that we're going to hold your story with integrity, and we won't share the details of your story outside the circle because we're holding it with integrity. Generosity is about walking with kindness. I really like the word kind, because the root of that word is kin. It's about being a relative. And so that's what kindness is because we all know when a relative comes to us in need, somebody we love and cherish in our lives, if they're in need, of course we share with them everything that we can. So that's what generosity is. It's connected to kindness. But I think there's more to it as well. If you look at the first part of the word generosity, it's the same first part of in the word generations as well. So when I think about that connection between kindness and generations, I think about that old story that says true kindness is when it's like when old men plant trees, and they do it knowing that they'll never see the shade or maybe even the fruit of the tree because they're old, but they do it nonetheless. It's for the future generations. And I think that's important for this work that we do around decolonizing. We might not see the impact of what we can do now, because it might take generations to bear fruit, but that shouldn't stop us from doing what we can do right now, because it'll affect the future generations. But I also want to add this to thinking about generations. Not only is it forward, but what about behind us? What about our ancestors? What about the people that we have heritage from and connection to? A lot of times we don't spend time thinking about our own history. And that's particularly important when we're thinking about colonization. What has been the impact of colonization? And for those of you that have engaged with our work at a deeper level, you know that we talk about something called the older story of colonization, where we ask the question, what happened to European people to bring them to our shores in 500 years ago? And we start exploring the roots of colonial activity on us. And that leads us to looking at the older story of colonization. And when you do that, you recognize that colonization has been happening over and over again throughout the world. And in particular in Europe, the indigenous people of Europe at one time were colonized. And out of that milieu and out of that cauldron of colonization, because there wasn't the opportunity to heal, the colonized became the colonizer. So it's important to look at the generations not only forward and to consider them, but also the generations behind us. And that takes courage. And in fact, this work takes courage. And I like the word courage because, as Brené Brown says, the root of this word in French is heart. And so it's less an act of bravery and valor and more of something that comes from that deep place within you. And we want people to be vulnerable in this work, to share from their heart, to share from their experiences. And we know that that's not easy. It's risky and it feels scary. So we try to create those spaces where vulnerability is encouraged. And an elder just recently said to me, he said, courage is less an act of, it's less of a value and more of an activator of values. And I really like that because it's the intentionality, it's the volition to step into this work, which again isn't easy. So it requires that courage for us to be on this journey. And empathy is about understanding and caring. As you listen to each other's stories, it It often touches us because, when somebody shares with us their struggles and their hardship, a lot of times we can feel what they're feeling. And the reason why is because stories of struggle and hardship are familiar to all of us. All of us have gone through heartbreak and loss in our lives. So empathy is about feeling what other people are feeling, but we can feel it because we've gone through it as well. So there's that connection. And then you can respond if it's being asked for from that place. You can show care for that person who's going through a struggle because they might feel alone in that moment, because that's what often happens when we go through struggles. We feel alone. So empathy is about letting that person know that they're not alone, that you're there if they want you to be there for them, that you're there for them. The last thing that we're often reminded of in terms of the glue that holds us together is fortitude. It's going to take some time. It might take generations, so we have to be willing to be in this work for the long haul. But I think there's more to the word fortitude as well, and I think it's hidden in the root of this word. In Latin, fortitude means strength of mind, forte and tude. And so we have to be able to have that space where we put our minds together. And so I think about that as critical thinking, that it's critical thinking. I think we have to expand our understanding of what critical thinking is, not to criticize, but how do we think about things? And that big picture way of doing this work, that systems thinking, I think is really based in critical thinking, or it inspires critical thinking. And oftentimes when we jump into critical thinking when there's a need, so it's often reactionary. But I think we also have to create spaces where it's proactive, where we're thinking ahead before things happen, that it's creative, that it's generative, and that it's constructive. We have to think about critical thinking in that way, or thinking in that way. But here's the catch. If we're living with unprocessed trauma, it's very difficult to think critically. It's very difficult to think creatively when you're so busy living in a survivor mode. You can't think clearly because we're often hypervigilant for danger and threat because we have unprocessed trauma. So we can't actually think critically in that moment. So I think fortitude, strength of mind, is also speaking to healing, because we know that psychological trauma gets trapped in our brains and in our nervous system. And oftentimes, unprocessed trauma is trapped with images and feeling. And so that's why triggering is so profound, is when you're reminded of that terrible experience you might have went through, images and feelings come forward. And then that stimulates your mind into producing adrenaline and cortisol. It makes your heart race, it makes you sweat. And pretty soon you're hyper-focused on threat again, you're going to get tunnel vision. So you can't think clearly in that moment. So I think strength of mind is speaking to healing, because when we're able to process that trauma, it doesn't mean that experience goes away and we forget about it. It just means that if we're reminded of that traumatic experience, we can recognize it and then put it into the upper parts of our brain, the reasoning part of our brain, where we can say, that reminds me of that experience, but it's not happening. I'm okay. I'm among friends. That's just a memory. I'm okay in this moment. So then adrenaline and cortisol doesn't start coursing through your system. So I really think we need that kind of space of healed thinking, or on the journey of being healed, so that we can think critically and from a place of a strong mind. And what I like about all of these values is that these are universal values. These are not just for Indigenous people. These are universal global values that many of you, if not all of you on this call, strive to work with and operate from and encourage in your own life. And so the last thing I want to, or another emergent way that we've been talking about this work, and when we're thinking about decolonizing, is to think about the science behind why structures like this, why processes like circles are so important. It's helpful to understand, what's going on in our bodies in this moment. So we really see the circle process is really useful because it's a disruptor of colonial structure. So I want to introduce you to a term that we've been working with that comes from the wonderful work of Dr. Michael Yellowbird, And so he's coined a phrase called neurodecolonization, or a word, neurodecolonization. So his way of talking about this is, if we want to decolonize, then we have to know that we have to start with our minds. So again, going back to fortitude, strength of mind, to know that we've been impacted in our minds and in our nervous systems, somatically, that controls the way our bodies react as well. So we need to decolonize our minds. So he calls that neurodecolonization. And he has a really powerful way of talking about it. So this is what he's referencing. This term refers to the specialized cells in the nervous system, brain, and spinal cord that send and receive electrical signals throughout the body. So decolonization refers to the activities that weaken the effects of colonialism and facilitate resistance and create opportunities to promote traditional practices in present-day settings. So the circle is a traditional practice. And so Indigenous cultural safety and the way that we've been using it encourages us to enter into a different process that actually flies in the face of colonization and colonial structures. So what Dr. Michael Yellowbird does is he shows what goes on in the brain of a person who's in processes that are not colonial. So things like meditation and ceremony and prayer, things like that, he's able to show the differences in a person's brain. So it helps us to understand why these ways of being are so important. So yes, he does that through brain imaging. And if you'll notice in this particular picture, the right brain is more activated, creating a sense of well-being, positive thoughts, etc., which helps with critical thinking. And it begins to release feel-good chemicals like serotonin and dopamine. And so we can start to develop new neural pathways associated with a deeper sense of self and empathy in these spaces like circles or ceremony and places like that. So just one example that I wanted to share with you is, and if you can find this in this online, he has a video called Healing Through Neurodecolonization and Mindfulness. It's a 1 hour long video, Decolonizing the Mind. So he talks about in that talk this ceremony that comes from his culture. So he's an Indigenous person. So he talks about this one ceremony called singing to the sacred cedar tree. And so he describes in the video, you'll see he describes how it's a very long ceremony involving, nature and community way of doing this ceremony. So what he helps us to notice is what's going on. So the parietal lobe in this picture, that's the area of our brain that helps us with spatial reasoning. So it helps us to understand that, here's a computer screen and I can touch it with my hands. It helps us to see that difference. But when you're in ceremony or meditation, that starts to quiet down. And so the more we sing to the tree, the parietal lobe quiets down and we stop seeing ourselves as separate from, but an extension of that tree or nature. So it brings this profound connection to how, whatever it is that we're concentrating on and doing within this ceremony. And I think that's why, if you look at the history of colonization, you'll see that our ceremonies were outlawed from the late 1800s until the 1950s. Colonization needed to do that because it needed to separate us from our strength, our way of seeing the world and being connected that was nurtured through our ways of life and through our ceremonies. So that's why I think there was such a direct attack on our cultural practices. And if you look at residential schools, they named that as it was a way of separating children from their culture and from Indigenous people's rights. So that's why I think colonization needed to attack our cultural practices. And if you look at colonial history throughout the world, you'll see that often happens. It attacks those Indigenous ways of understanding the world and those things that help to maintain that understanding. So the last thing I'm going to share here, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sue for the next portion, is for those of you that have taken part in our workshops, we often start with we share a film, a pre-learning video called How a People Live. And it's a story about the Guasala and Nakutau people that lived on, two distinct people that lived on the northwest coast of what we know as Canada now. And for the ease of administration through the federal colonial government, they forcibly removed them from their traditional territories and put them on a reserve that was created for them on the northern tip of Vancouver Island near the town of Port Hardy, called Sequati Reserve. And this is a story that tells what happened. They were tricked into moving, and when they went, they were told, come and look at this wonderful reserve we built for you. Everybody will have a house, every family will have a house, and you'll have all the amenities. So they went to have a look, because they said, just come and have a look. And as they left to go and have a look, the Indian agents went in and burned their homes down. They had no place to return to. And when they got to Sequati Reserve, there was 8 homes for several hundred people with no running water, no sewer system. So it tells a story of colonial activity in terms of putting people onto reserves, forcing them onto reserves in such a terrible way. And then with all the other laws that were in place, the potlatch laws, which banned their spiritual practices, they were totally disconnected from their thousands of year old way of life. And so it tells a story of what happened to them, the outcome of it, and then it also talks about how they're reviving and how they're living again. Because the term "how a people live" is in direct reference to a book that was written by an anthropologist who named his book "How a People Die." He was trying to show how you kill a people off. They didn't like that title. They wanted to talk about how a people live. So it's a very profound documentary that shows that. But what I wanted to say, as I in terms of the growth that we're doing in doing this work, just recently I was able to attend a potlatch in Port Hardy, where one of the families was renewing their ways of being in terms of cultural practices, and they talked about some of the potlatches that they're going to do in the future that haven't been done for 140 years. They're going to reintroduce those cultural practices. And as I sat there participating for 2 days in their potlatch ceremony, it dawned on me just how powerful it was to sit and to listen to and watch these powerful ceremonies, the songs, the dancing, the way that they do things was probably affecting my brain and everybody's brain there, because there was a restoration of those cultural practices based on ceremony, and it was impacting our brains. So that's part of the healing process for us as Indigenous people, to return back to these ceremonial ways. And we know now through the work of Dr. Yellowbird of what that's actually doing. And that's so essential to the work of decolonizing. So that's all I'm going to say for now. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sue to talk about the somatics praxis. And praxis means, the combination of theory and practice. So Sue's going to share with you what we've been learning and what she's been working on.
Thanks, Harley. And yeah, I'll help to connect some dots between what Harley's already said and to somatics and why somatics and the practice is so important in dealing with colonization. So somatics is the field which studies the soma, and the soma is the body as perceived from within. So it's a first person experience. No one else can experience your somatic experience. In Greek, the word comes from the body living in its wholeness. So we've been separated, and I'm speaking as a white person, but also a lot of what I am going to be communicating to you can definitely be applied to all people, because we've all been separated from different parts of ourselves and our cultures and our own people and family because of colonization, because of capitalism, paternalism, and the various oppressions we've been experiencing, not just in our own lives, but in our ancestry. So somatics and decolonizing, I'm going to be connecting why we're using somatics in looking at decolonizing work. So trauma is stored in our bodies, and our bodies remember and remind us to pay attention and address that trauma. And we experience the stuff that we're holding, that we've had maybe not had a chance to complete or metabolize. So this trauma, it's like when you experience a big emotion and you don't have time to process it, say it's anger, say it's rage, fear, and you suppress it and you push it down, it goes somewhere, it stays in our bodies. And so those things that we have suppressed can build and create all kinds of problems, including chronic illness, muscle tension, headaches, and more. And for years, even as a child, I remember feeling like I had something in my body, in my abdomen, maybe sometimes in my chest, that kind of was bothering me. Every time I got upset, it would kind of trigger something in my body. And so we're talking about what to do with that, how to shift that. And so in doing whiteness work, what I have found is that we've separated our heads, our intellect from the rest of our body. And so in the capitalist world, that the brain and the intellect seems to be the most important thing. And so we really focus a lot on knowledge, information. And so with decolonizing, it's important to reconnect. So getting reconnected to our bodies and work on healing from trauma increases our awareness of white body language, of energy, and for those of us who are white, to understand the energy and body language of Black and Indigenous and people of color. And as well, this can apply to people of color and Indigenous folks. It's really helpful to figure out how to read body language of people who present as white. Although it tends to be a little more common and something that is practiced with people of color because of safety, the need to be safe. Let me see. So yeah, let's just switch to the next slide, Harley, thanks. So where did the deep-seated fear of the other come from, or difference? And what do we know about our ancestors' experience with oppression? European trauma and white supremacy culture. As white people of European descent, we've historically, over thousands of years, experienced various traumas: upheavals requiring relocation, starvation, food scarcity, colonization by other European nations, plagues, illnesses that resulted in loss of community, family members in large numbers over short periods of time, natural disasters, and more. And because as people of European descent, we were not able to heal from those traumas because they were piling one on top of the other, so many deaths without time, and needing to take the energy to just survive, we were not able to heal from a lot of what we experienced. And so we ended up being fearful of a lot of things, and fearful of people that we didn't know, and fearful of scarcity, fearful of a lot of things, fear of nature, especially as we were pushed to different areas. For example, my ancestors from Flanders, we were pushed to further south into the Netherlands, and then into Prussia and Russia, and then into onto Turtle Island. And so every time we moved, we were experiencing new land, new animals, new experiences that we didn't know how to deal with. And on top of all the traumas, it created a lot of fear. So white supremacy culture has developed as a result of European trauma. White people have been socialized to fear Black, Indigenous, and people of color through the news, through movies, through TV, through the way we've been taught history. And for me personally, stories and books that I read growing up, especially the books that I loved, which were British-based children's novels. It's helpful to unpack how we've bought into racism as white folks and white supremacy culture in order to dismantle its power over us. One of the other areas that I have found really important to look at, which is very much connected to somatics, is the way we as white folks carry energy. So everyone, regardless of racialization, carries energy, which can affect those around us. You know, when you walk into a room, you can feel the energy. As a woman, when I'm walking down the street, during certain times of day or night, I can get a sense of safety or lack of safety, depending on how I perceive people. Sometimes it's their body language, sometimes it's their energy. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So white people tend to be fairly unaware of their energy because we're not as negatively affected by our use of it. We have less to worry about safety-wise when we are doing whatever we do on on a daily basis. And Black, Indigenous, and people of color are much more aware of personal energy and group energy, since it's important for their safety. White energy can be especially felt when our emotions are strong, when we're flexing power, like when we're feeling like it's my turn, or feeling that we're uncomfortable, or feeling uncomfortable because we are not feeling powerful. We often use our energy without even realizing it. It can feel to us like we're just being in charge, we're just taking responsibility, we're being efficient, or we're being protective. But people can feel that energy, so we need to pay attention and learn about it. So with somatics, one of the things that I've learned that's really helpful is that somatics, it isn't a band-aid. It's a practice that can actually change the capacity that we have for holding intense emotions, that it can help us metabolize difficult sensations, difficult emotions, and help us to have more space, so that when we're in a situation where there's conflict, or where there's a stressful conversation, that we have more time and space and energy to take what we're hearing and not just react to it, but actually where our prefrontal cortex stays online, and we're able to do the executive functioning of continuing a conversation, or actually being present to be able to really hear what people are trying to say, and to actually have the ability to think clearly about how to answer, how our body language is working in the situation, those kinds of things. We're capable of healing from trauma. Back when I was first, in university back in the 90s, or late 80s, early 90s, the idea was that for trauma, we need to figure out how to cope with it. We thought at the time that that the brain wasn't plastic, that it wasn't able to make changes in neural pathways. It takes time, and we need to work on it slowly to allow our minds to shift and our bodies to handle the emotions without overwhelming us or giving us too much to handle while we're healing. The healing can exhaust us. It can have us feeling bruised and raw. What will begin to lift the intensity and lead to healing is turning toward the sensation. So we're realizing that what commonly happens when people are feeling traumatized, feeling overwhelmed, is they go to things like medication. Deal with your headache by taking some Tylenol. Relax after a really hard day by drinking some alcohol and helping your body to relax. And what those things do is help us cope and maybe numb the big sensations. And what we're finding is that if we turn toward the sensation and sit with it 5 to 10 minutes, maybe more, it can start to shift, and our bodies can start to tell us things. Sometimes images come to mind while I'm sitting and trying to metabolize the emotional stuff that I've dealt with in a day. So resma manicum is a social worker who is a licensed clinical therapist, and also a what he has developed is what he calls somatic abolitionism. So basically, it is the use of somatics, the somatic practice, to face and deal with racism. So his definition of white body supremacy, which we're going to be using here, is that individual and institutional attitudes, practices, policies that elevate the white body as the standard against which all other persons' worth is measured. That is what he considers white body supremacy. So white body supremacy right here isn't referring to what often comes to mind, which is extreme neo-Nazi kind of people and individuals. But what we're talking about is that our society basically has been created, is controlled, the standard is whiteness. And for those of us who have come ancestrally from Europe, like my ancestors have, we had to buy into white supremacy culture in order to fit into society here on Turtle Island in what's now North America. We let go of our culture, our practices, and Harley was talking a little bit earlier about the rituals, the ceremonies, the things that Indigenous people have that, and they're working to bring back as a result of being separated from a lot of this because of colonial law, colonial oppression. And we've lost that as well. And what we've given up is for being able to fit into society, to make money, to gain the things that we felt that we needed so that we could feel safe in North America. White body supremacy was first described in the writings of Resmaa Menakem as a type of embodied trauma response, resulting from the intergenerational transmission of oppressive race-based biases and fears held in the body. White body supremacy is the construct grounded in the belief that reflexive responses that sustain racism are often unconscious and manifest at a physiological level. Menakem challenges the idea that such deeply embedded patterns can be transformed through cognitive processes alone, but rather must be addressed somatically. So what Resmaa has come to is that we have in North American culture and society, as we've been trying to dismantle racism and white supremacy culture, we've used intellect, knowledge, giving people information about history, giving people information about the results of colonization. We've also appealed to people's good nature. Let's build relationships across difference. Let's build bridges between communities and cultures so that we can, if we only understood each other, then we would not have racism. But what he's found is that there's an area that we haven't really looked at very, very deeply, and that is the soma. Like, what are we holding in our bodies, and how do we deal with what our bodies have been holding? And for me, I think about, you know, the books I read as a child, the movies, the Disney movies that I watched as a child, things that I took in that I didn't have a chance to discuss, to understand, but things that kind of got imprinted in my brain. This understanding that what I was reading was true, especially as a child. What I was watching, it didn't feel hurtful to me. But if I had been Harley growing up watching some of the same things, I would have felt hurt by some of the images, some of the ways that Indigenous people were talked about in books that I read, like Little House on the Prairie. So those images have been in my brain and they influence me today. And so when I am interacting with Indigenous people, some of those things that I learned early on as a child will be part of what triggers me to think about Indigenous people in ways that aren't helpful. So we need to really dig in and sit with what we're holding in our systems somatically so that we can lift those sensations, and triggers will feel a little less intense, and we'll have a better ability to hear and take in information, and also to be our best selves in the situations where we are working to address racism. I just want to ask you, Harley, too, was there anything that I missed that would be helpful to speak to? I just want to make sure that this is a shorter workshop than we usually do, and so I'm just wanting to make sure that I was understandable in that.
Yeah, very understandable. Thank you, Sue. And I think we'll get to the question part of our time. So then some questions I'm sure will come up from the group here. But thank you so much for that. And the last thing that we wanted to say is it's, as we've been doing this work, it's, the guiding principles have remained for us, especially over the last 10 years, but otherwise too, for the work that we've been doing for the last almost 30 years now. Seems like they remain the same. Like I remember years ago thinking about critical thinking or learning about it, and now it's growing in my own way of understanding, and as we work with others. And so it's kind of like that with the definitions that we shared with you earlier as well around cultural safety and cultural humility. So what we see is that we're maintaining this, but we're kind of re-envisioning, if you will, and deepening our understanding of these definitions. So we've added a few words here into the definition. So it's still an outcome. We're hoping this is what we're reaching for and striving for. But we're trying to address those power imbalances inherent in those colonial systems, but also recognizing, as Sue said, that we've been influenced by the systems as well, including our bodies. So we want to look at those power dynamics within our bodies and how we've been impacted and conditioned. And certainly the work that Sue does around whiteness is focusing on that aspect. And then we've highlighted the word feel too, because we're starting to learn that it's so important that sense of feeling. And in fact, in some of the work that we're doing, the phrase trauma-informed practice, which is a really helpful skill, we've altered the name to be trauma-sensitive care, intentionally talking about senses. What's going on in our bodies and noticing those things, and then what we can start to do differently. And then I won't say too much more about cultural humility. You can see how we've highlighted the important parts that the processes become so important, and relationships, being relational is so important. But the last part, cultural humility involves humbly acknowledging oneself as a learner when it comes to understanding another's experience or even our own. And I think that's very important for people like Sue who are white and maybe don't realize they carry that long history, an experience with colonization longer than mine. Mine is probably maybe around 300, 350 years old in terms of my heritage and my ancestry. But for somebody like Sue, as she explained, it's 1,000 years old, what her ancestors have lived through in terms of colonization and not had the opportunity to heal from. So I think we'll just leave it there, and we'd love to hear some comments and thoughts. And so I will turn this back over to Catherine and Neil.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Sue and Harley. And I don't know, you're probably not following the chat, but there's a lot of gratitude coming through to you. A lot of, I'm seeing lots of heart icons. I'm seeing lots of powerful, wonderful, people are connecting with this work in a full agreement that Somatics is so deeply part of this work. Many, many comments like that. So thank you so much. And perhaps I'll just invite people to give a virtual applause, either, on the screen or in the chat room, just to send some love and some gratitude out out to Harley and Sue. And I will acknowledge there was one direct question and a couple of comments that could sort of be converted into a question. So why don't I start, just because we've got about 8 minutes remaining, I'll start with those 3 comment questions, and that might take us to the end. And if there's time, of course, we can open it up to more questions, but I think this might take us down to the end. So Sue, the direct question was with regard to when you were framing the opening of your work, you talked about people who present as white. And there was a question around, what about if somebody might present as white, but internally that doesn't resonate with their experience? So the specific question is, Sue, you mentioned people who present as white needing to reconnect somatically to recognize the effect of their body language. Is there an additional nuance in this case where presenting as white may not be how a person identifies internally? So that was the most direct question that, at least that I saw in the chat room. But there were also some other questions around racism and white privilege. What is the connection to power over? And I think in your closing comments, Harley, you started to really you went back to the definitions and you made that connection to power over. But if you could expand on that, or if either one of you could expand on that. And then finally, a little bit earlier in the talk, Harley, when you were speaking about circle practice, there was a bit of conversation in the chat. One person mentioned that they have a history of trauma and find circle practice triggering, mentioning in particular that it's hard to sit still. But understanding from the perspective you shared around the neurodecolonization and some of the teachings you were offering was actually quite healing. And then another person mentioned that their leader or their executive said circles are inappropriate and unacceptable. So just wondering if you could add to when it might be helpful to engage in circle practice, and if there are perhaps times when it's not so helpful, or how to respond if, on the one hand, if somebody is triggered, on the other hand, if an executive or somebody in a position of power is offering that it's not the right, from their perspective, not the right way to engage. So those are some questions for both of you, Sue and Harley. I leave it to you to decide which order to answer them in.
Okay. I think Harley could probably help me with the comment about white, appearance of being white. That's always an area that that has some difficulty, because for folks who are what is often called white passing, the world and the powerful people in the world, the white folks in the world, will see them in a certain way, and as well, people of color will see them in a certain way. And so there's a bit of juggling around how you are accepted in the world if you can pass as a white person.
Yeah, just to add to that, thank you, Sue, and thank you for that really good question. It's so again, it's the process of how we look at that, because it's something that has to be looked at, because it's so important, and I think there's a reason why sometimes we don't want to identify as being white, because we see all the terrible things that have happened because of whiteness and white supremacy and all of those things. So we don't want to identify. But as Sue was saying, it's important to sit with that and to question that and get to that place where to take a look at that hard look. And when I started this our time together, I mentioned how this work isn't easy. But if we can use processes that help us to look, and that's why the side of the hill is helpful, is if we can first kind of understand the dynamics and the construct and the ideology of racism, where it comes from and how it's connected to colonialism. But eventually we do go to that place of locating self in that picture. So it's a journey, right? And so I would say build the space and build the understanding. Don't jump right into that question, like try to understand things at a much bigger level, and then eventually, find that way to looking at, okay, so if my appearance is white, but I live in this world, constructed in this way, what does that mean for me? And so, and also finding others who are on that journey as well, that have been on that journey for a while, finding others that you can connect with. That's always important, because we can't do this work alone. That's what humility says, right? We can't do this work alone. So hopefully that's helpful.
I think of our kids when I hear this question, and that is that we've raised our kids in a way that we encourage them to question everything, and so and to accept both the good and the bad. If yeah, and I shouldn't polarize that. Just the various ways that we've been involved in the world, both in being oppressed and being oppressors. And so for our children, the understanding of, well, here's my white side of the family, which would be my side, and here's Harley's side of the family. How do I understand that? How does it fit together? Because our children are whole beings. They're fully Indigenous, yet they can also be fully white. And there's a lot of contradictions in that. Though when they walk in the world, their power, they hold power differently than their dad might hold power. And they hold power differently than I would hold power. And so it's uncomfortable to think about, but it's something that is really important to do.
I think that's a good segue into the question around power over. So absolutely, I mean, once you start looking at the structures and patterns of systemic racism, you see that how power over is utilized. But as you peel back the layers, then you understand kind of why. Because power over is about keeping danger out, right? Or that's, you start to realize that that's what was inception. Its inception was keeping the danger out. But then that starts to become normalized. It becomes intrinsic in the culture to continue to do that. So the danger might not be there anymore, but you're still doing the power over, right? So that's what this kind of work can help us to sort through. And then secondly to that, that power over has dynamics that have affected our bodies somatically. And so the work of somatics is to recognize that, to sit with that, and then to build skill and repetitions that help us to not be as activated in those moments. So it think critically, we can understand those dynamics, recognize that our bodies have been impacted, and then start to change some of those dynamics. It helps us to think more critically and to see our way through these patterns. And the last thing I'll say, just recognizing we have this 1 minute over, thank you for the person who mentioned about us being triggered in circles, but maybe there's another way of thinking about that. And if you remember, I said that there's like practices. It doesn't just have to be the circle, but those other practices that help you get to the same place, those ancient practices, doesn't have to be in the circle. It's one useful way, a good way of doing this work, but it doesn't have to be that way. And always the hope of the circle is that if we can have that place to practice it, then we can walk in this world with those teachings in every moment. So that's what the circle process helps us to do. And then really the last thing I'll say around, I think sometimes if we're told you can't do that, it's not appropriate here. I think we have to figure out, so how do we be tricksters? How do we figure out other ways of doing this work? And again, once you start to be able to think critically, you can find those ways, right? And then if you're talking with others too, critically thinking with others, you can find other ways and to go around those colonial roadblocks.
Yeah. For those of you who have experience with circles, it's often resistance is often around power. Because in circles, everyone is supposed to have the same amount of power. That doesn't usually that isn't really what happens. There's always people with more power, but it helps to eliminate the power difference between people. Sitting all at the same level, nobody's standing, nobody under, everybody having a little more control over how long they speak, those kinds of things. And it's often not considered efficient. And I remember Harley and I were in a situation where this very question came up about leadership, saying this isn't going to help, this isn't going to work. What we found was that with pushback and with Indigenous people and allies present to say, we're going to do it anyway. We need to try it. What happened was everything got said, everything got not resolved, but all the things we needed to work on actually got finished by using the circle, but it was not in the way that the leadership person who wanted the control to see it happen.
Well, thank you so much. And you know what, I know we're actually 3 minutes over time, but there was just one more question that I found in the chat. So if you'll indulge me, I would like to share this with you, and then we'll wrap up after this one last question, Sue. This person was especially connecting with what you were talking about and asking, do the somatic processing principles apply to perceptions as a woman from the grooming and conditioning that we have received as white women? Particularly, I'm referring to my perspective growing up in the 80s and 90s. So, sort of locating themselves historically, but what about the grooming as white women? Is there anything you might say just to round us off here, to wrap us up with regard to somatic experiences of being a white woman?
Well, that's huge. I think one of the things that comes to mind, this might not answer your question completely, but what I have found, because I work a lot with white women, I do coaching for white women who are looking to dismantle whiteness in their lives and to look for a new culture beyond white supremacy culture, is that for those of us who identify as female or who present as female, we walk in the world in ways where we have a better sense in some ways of what's happening somatically inside us than men, because of the less power that we have in the world where males are power over. And so for us, when we walk into a parking garage at night by ourselves, there are things that we feel, there are things that we sense. If we hear a noise, there are things that we do. If we see a person, there's things that happen in our bodies that I know for when Harley loves parking in parking garages. I don't. So when we go into a parking garage together, Harley walks in a different way than I do. So we have, in some ways, as white women, we have a benefit of getting a little bit more of a sense of what people of color and Indigenous people go through somatically as well. And so being able to get a better sense and handle on the stuff that we're holding.
Well, thank you for that. It's a huge topic. I'm sure it could be a whole other webinar and maybe a lifetime of learning. So at this point, I'll say thank you once again to Harley and Sue for your generous offering of your time, your teachings, the knowledge that you have accumulated in your minds, your hearts, your bodies over these years, and your ability to share them, as one person in the chat said, to share this knowledge so skillfully with us today. We will be sharing the recording, so everyone who signed up for the talk will receive this recording, and you're welcome to share it with your friends, your colleagues, your family, your neighbors, etc. And we're just so deeply grateful to everyone who joined, all the energy that came together to make this session possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And with that, we'll call it a day.